Okay, so today we are reviewing this book, Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. This is surprisingly, this book is an emotional read. I did not expect that, but it is. And today we're going to talk about this book that I never knew existed until recently, and it has changed the way that that I view these types of books, but we'll get into that when we get to the spoiler section. So hello and welcome to this review. If you have not seen a review of mine before, I break my reviews up into two sections. The first section is spoiler free, where I give you 3 pros and 3 cons in a spoiler free way about the book. Then we delve into the spoiler section where I gush or rant about all the things that I thought in a spoilery way about the book. So let's jump right into the spoiler-free section as I give you 3 pros and 3 cons for this book. I can't give you a con for this book, and that is saying a lot. It is becoming more common now for me to not be able to give a con, but of all the books that I've read so far this year, it is very uncommon, if I look at all of them as a whole, it's very uncommon for me to not even be able to give one con to a book, but I just couldn't. So I'm going to jump directly into the 3 pros and try to keep it to 3, but I might make it even more. I'm going to start off with my first pro being the writing style. It is really easy to read. Despite the fact that this book is a dual perspective book, we follow 2 characters through alternating chapters through their own perspective. We follow Juliet and Declan. So despite it being a dual perspective book, it is really still easy to read and easy to manage. I've read many multi-perspective books this year, and some of them have been so tough to handle, but this book not only feels like a breeze to deal with the dual perspectiveness of it, but also I feel it wouldn't work if it was a singular perspective or if it was written from the perspective of an omniscient narrator. So I feel that Bridget Kemmerer made the right choice by making this multi-perspective, and the writing itself is really easy to read, which is something I always talk about on this channel. I think that an easy to read writing style makes for a much more entertaining read than a more complex writing style that could either distract you or finds you every couple of pages trying to look up what a word is or trying to translate what the heck your author is trying to say. Bridget Kemmerer writes in a very easy to read writing style, and that should certainly be celebrated. My second pro for this book is that the second half of this book is an emotional read. Now, some people might view that as a con because some people don't want to read emotional books, and if that's like you, if you're like that and you don't like an emotional read, I am going to give you that heads up. I was on the verge of tears many times from the halfway mark through to the end. The first half of the book, not so much, but certainly by the second half of the book onwards, it gets more and more emotional. But to me, this is a pro, because if a book is going to make me feel things, I feel that that makes the book even better. It kind of transcends the basic standard reading experience. My third pro for this book are the characters in general. Both Juliet and Declan, I have to keep looking at the back because I keep forgetting the male protagonist's name. Both Juliet and Declan come from 2 completely different worlds, however they have one thing that they have in common that kind of puts them together. But their character arc throughout this book is amazing, and I really do appreciate that. I will add in one more spoiler-free pro, and that is the subject matter. This book deals, even though it is a fictional book, it heavily deals with with death and grief and loss and those sorts of things, and Bridget Kemmerer deals with this stuff really, really well. So like I was saying, I can't give any cons for this book. I do highly recommend that you pick this book up. It is a very underrated book. I don't know if there was lack of advertising for the book or if people just chose not to read it, but I don't see any reason why you shouldn't read it unless there are certain things about death, grief, and loss that can be triggering for you, then it might trigger you. I don't think that it will, but I also don't think I can sit here and say that it won't. So if that kind of thing can trigger you, then the book might trigger you. It is YA, it's not adult. But otherwise, I definitely recommend picking this book up because it's an amazing read. And yeah, I think you will enjoy it. I ended up giving this book 5 stars. It is a YA contemporary. And so now I'm going to move on to the spoiler section of this book and discuss the spoiler side of Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer. Okay, so first of all, I want to highlight this spoiler section by saying that Bridget Kemmerer is an author that I completely trust after just reading one book, which doesn't happen often for me, but I came away from this book thinking that Bridget Kemmerer could even rival one of my all-time, if not my all-time, favourite authors, Brandon Sanderson, just because of how amazing this book is, and I do plan on reading the second book in this series. I don't remember what it's called. I think it's called More Than We Can Tell. I'm so sorry. But I do plan on hopefully reading it in August if I can get the book on time. But I completely trust Bridget Kemmerer, and she's written about, I think, about 10 books, and I would like to read some more of hers, not just the second book in this series. So I just want to say, I think on the whole, she's an amazing author, and I can't believe it's taken me this long to read one of her books. So let's talk about this book in the spoilery way. This book opens up with Declan. I again have to keep looking at the back because I don't remember his name. He's given a nickname by another character, which is, his surname is Murphy, so he's given the nickname of Murph. So I keep thinking of him as Murph and not as Declan, so I do apologise. The book opens up with Declan, who is a juvenile criminal. He has committed a crime, and owing to the crime that he committed, he is sentenced to 90 hours of community service, and that community service is to be held at a graveyard where he is going to be mowing the lawns of the graves. So one day he is in a section of the graveyard and he's about to mow there, but before he can mow there, one of the big rules they have is to remove all the personal items around the gravestone so that they don't get destroyed, which makes sense. So you temporarily remove them, place them in a safe space, mow the lawn, and then put it back. Makes sense, right? So while he's removing some personal possessions from a particular gravestone, he sees a letter and he decides to open up this letter, which is a little bit controversial, but this is what moves things in the direction that we end up going into. This letter is written from a daughter to the woman who is in the grave, who is her mother, and Declan loves this letter so much, and not only does he appreciate it so much, but he also understands it so much that he writes 2 words at the bottom of the letter, "Me too," and puts the letter back to the gravestone after he has mown the area around that gravestone. When Juliet returns to the gravestone, she of course notices that the letter has been read and that "Me too" is written on the bottom, and at first she is really upset about it, so she goes to complain to Declan's boss, who is there, but moments before she actually does complain to him, she decides to let it go, and she ultimately ends up writing back to him, back to whoever this mysterious person is who has left the words "Me too" at the bottom of the letter and leave this response at her mother's grave. What ensues is a back and forth letter writing experience, anonymous letter writing experience, kind of similar to You've Got Mail, but definitely much more hard-hitting. You've Got Mail is more of a romantic comedy. This is more of a grief and loss, particularly surrounding death book. So Declan's sister, just had to think there for a moment, Declan's sister Carrie has died, and obviously Juliet's mother has died. So they correspond back and forth with letters, and things are going really, really well until about halfway through the book when Declan realizes exactly who he's writing to, that it is Juliet. And Juliet and Declan kind of know of each other. They don't know each other, but they know of each other. At least Juliet knows of Declan because the crime that he committed was so heavily publicized that everyone at school knows who Declan Murphy is. So she has all these thoughts of the kind of person that he might be because of a lot of rumors that are spread around the high school that they go to. And yeah, she just doesn't like him as a person at all, and she's really scared of him. One day, her car breaks down, and Declan ends up helping her, which is really nice of him. And she starts. This is the beginning point where she starts to see a good side to Declan. Again, she doesn't know that it's him who's contacting her, but she sees this in person happening, and she starts to appreciate it a little bit, and the seed is beginning to be planted as far as the trust between the two of them. Eventually, the handwritten letters turn into a chat, I guess. Like, I don't know what I would call the chat itself, but does anyone remember back in the day MSN Messenger, or even maybe like Facebook Messenger, but MSN because it's much more anonymous? So first they start emailing each other, then they start instant messaging each other, but it's still all very anonymous. Declan, as I said, does find out that it is Juliet, and he doesn't know whether or not to tell her. And then one day, Declan is very angry about something, and he ends up saying that his sister died on the 25th of May in front of Juliet, which plants the seed in Juliet to think, is it Declan that I've been writing to this whole time? And she really hopes that it's not, because she really hates him. She poses the question to this anonymous person, are you Declan? And Declan decides to not tell her at that time, which I think was a very smart move, because they were, through the anonymous correspondences that they have, regardless of the form of correspondence that they're having with each other, they're really helping each other. So I think Declan made the right move to not tell her. Eventually, Juliet does find out that it is Declan, though, and by this point, they're actually okay. They've had a few discussions in person, and they're actually okay. So, in the end, some really emotional scenes do occur. So I'm going to start off first of talking about Juliet. So with Juliet on her side of things, her mother died, and as far as she is aware, at least at the beginning of the book, her mother comes back early from a trip. Her mother is a photographer. She takes photographs, particularly in during wars and things like that, very dramatic things that are going on. She's a photographer, and Juliet has asked her mother to come back early for some reason that I don't remember. And so her mother comes back, but the night that she comes back, she ends up in a car accident and she dies. We find out by the end of the book that no, this is actually not what happened. Well, that is, yes, what happened, but it's not. It didn't happen the way that Juliet thought it did. We find out by the end of the book that, in fact, Juliet's mother came back 3 days earlier than everyone else thought that she did, so that she could go and be with a friend of hers or a co-worker or something who she is having an affair with. And Juliet finds this out when still trying to work out who killed her mother, because they don't know who killed her. They just know that, she was killed. Her best friend's boyfriend recommends to her to get her mother's latest photos that are in her camera developed and published, not published, developed, so that she can see if there's any kind of evidence. Maybe she took a photo of her attacker or of the killer. It's something that's not completely unheard of, according to her best friend's boyfriend. So she decides to do this, and what the photos show is not the attacker, but instead the photos show her mother having an affair, laying in bed with this guy, and it completely breaks Juliet's heart, which is completely understandable. She confronts her dad about it, and her dad says, look, I had a feeling this was what was going on. Your mother was a very free spirit, and so as I said, he says, I had the feeling this was what was happening. And Juliet says, well, why didn't you leave her? She was cheating on us. And he said, well, you loved her. And not in a bad way, but in a really loving way. He says, well, you loved her. And so I didn't want to break you apart from her because of what was going on. And it was a really beautiful moment because after Juliet's mum passed away, Juliet and her dad became rather distant. So this really brought the two of them back together, which was, as sad as it was and as hard as it was to find out the betrayal of Juliet's mum having the affair, it was a really beautiful moment to have Juliet and her dad become so close because they both now know the secret that her mum was keeping. So now we're going to talk about Declan and what happened with his side of things. So basically when Declan was... Declan is 17. When he was, I think, 16 or 15 or something, he was rather young. One day, he was with his father at his father's work, and his father couldn't find his keys. Declan had actually stolen them and hid them in his pocket because his father drinks a lot, and he was scared of what would happen if his father was driving home. And eventually, Declan, I think, offers to drive his dad home. He's very young at this stage, but Declan's father, in the first of many bad decisions that Declan's family makes with regards to him, his father says, yes, I think that's a good idea. You should drive me home, which seriously... Full disclosure, I don't have my license, so I'm not in that situation myself, and certainly Declan didn't have his license at that stage either, but I'm sure if I'd told my dad that I would drive him home when I was Declan's age, my dad would have laughed, said, yeah, right, and, he would have still driven. I was very fortunate. I grew up in a very different situation to Declan. My dad hardly ever drinks at all, so it's a completely different situation, but... yeah, this was the first of several terrible decisions that Declan's family made regarding him. Anyway, one day Declan ends up driving, a few years later, he ends up driving home and smashes into a building. His sister ends up dying. But again, it was because he was driving his dad home. He was still so young. He shouldn't have been driving, but he was driving his dad home. And he ended up smashing into a building and killing his sister. Sorry, my memories are a bit warped with exactly how it went down. But anyway, the point is that his sister ends up dying, and that's why he got in trouble. He served... I believe it is 10 weeks, or is it? No, sorry, 10 hours. He served 10 hours in a juvenile detention centre and was given a sentence of 100 years of community service at the graveyard because of the incident, but because he'd spent the 10 hours at the juvenile detention centre, his hours were brought back down to 90 in lieu of the 10 hours he spent there. Anyway, so... his mother goes in and out of relationship. Well, his father ends up going to jail over the situation, but his mother, she just goes in and out of relationships, and Declan ends up describing this to his boss at the graveyard, who one day Declan has had enough. This is about halfway through the book, or 3/4 of the way through the book. He storms out of the graveyard and is going to go drive off a cliff or something because he's that angry, but his boss gets into the car and says, look, you talk, I'll listen, drive wherever you want, let's go. So his boss is amazing. This guy, so much love for him because he patiently sits there while Declan explains everything from the moment his sister was killed all the way through to what was happening that very day that they're driving. So yeah, he's very patient. Anyway, so Declan's mum, as I was saying, because we're going back and forth here with the discussion he's having with his boss and what's been happening to lead up to it. Declan's mum has been going in and out of relationships, and they've all been ending for all different reasons. One guy cheats on her, another guy is really abusive, another guy, it turns out, is gay, another guy has a wife. Like, she just has terrible luck. But anyway, eventually she settles down and marries this guy named Alan, who tried to be a stepfather to Declan, but Declan didn't want another father figure in his life, and then according to Declan, something kind of snapped in Alan after that, and Alan became more of a warden than someone that he was living with. He was always, yeah, just imposing his own rules and really making life hell for Declan. Anyway, so Declan's explaining all of this, and how he knows he's to blame for everything. He's such a screw up. He screws up everything. And his boss turns around and says, actually, I'm quite surprised that this is how everything has gone down. You're not to blame for this. I can't believe, and I love this because Declan tries to retort to the boss, but the boss says, don't interrupt. I listen to you, now you listen to me. From what you told me, your father let you drive the car. You shouldn't have been driving. You were a little kid. And for some reason, and I'm not remembering it all correctly, but for some reason his mother was actually to blame for some of the things as well. And she has never once apologized to Declan. She's, yeah, always acted like he is the one that was responsible for everything. Declan once said to his mother that he wanted to see his father, and his mother said no. The boss says the reason that your mother probably most likely doesn't want to see your father is because she feels guilty and she knows she has to face the consequences of what's going on. And yeah, it was just really, I'm probably not explaining this really well, but it was so emotional. And then Declan's driving home one day and he sees that Alan's car is stranded on the side of the road. Alan has broken down and Declan is trying to work out, should I stop and help him or, screw him, I'm just gonna leave him there because of how he treats me. And he does the latter. He ends up just driving past and not caring, but about a street or two later ends up turning around and coming back and goes and helps Alan. Alan doesn't want to be helped, but Declan has always had a love for mechanics. He learnt this from his father, and so from a very young age he's very much been what I would probably call an idiot savant, in that he's really knowledgeable about mechanics and things to do with cars. The total opposite to me. I don't know anything about cars except for that car's a blue car, that car's a green car, that car's a red car. But Declan, from a young age, has known so many things. He used to impress all these co-workers that his dad would have. His dad would always invite them around and say, watch this, Declan, what's wrong with the car? And Declan, as a kid, would be like, oh, this, and yeah. So he's talking to Alan saying, look, you got two options basically. You can pay a mechanic $300, or if we can get our way to an auto mechanic shop or a place that sells parts, we can pay $20 for a part and replace it and your car will be fine, so let's do that. It takes a while for Alan to agree, but on the way they have a really good discussion. And Alan says to Declan, look, it hurt me when you didn't want to have me as a stepfather, and I think that's what kind of affected our relationship. And they finally get to have some open and honest communication with each other, because this guy, Alan, we've seen moments with him throughout the book where he is rather verbally and even sometimes physically abusive to Declan. And yeah, and he apologizes for that. He says, look, I'm really sorry. There was even an incident that very morning, the morning of the accident, the morning that Alan's car broke down, where Alan accused Declan of winding up just like his father, and he apologizes for that too, saying, you're not going to end up like your father, you're so much better than he was. And they have this really beautiful discussion. I'm not doing it justice. You really need to read the book to appreciate just how well it was done. So yeah, I started crying from the moment the boss, like Declan's boss, was telling his side, saying, no, you're actually not to blame. This is not your fault. I can't believe people thought this was your fault. Why is your mum letting you think that it is? And oh my God. And then from there, Declan having his discussion with Alan and those two working things out, and both of them being rather realistic and knowing it's not going to change overnight, but we've started something. So Declan, after fixing his stepfather, Alan's car, goes home with him and goes to bed. Next morning he wakes up and sees an envelope near his bed, and the envelope contains $300, and he knew right away that it was Alan that had given it to him, and Declan is very angry about this because he feels that it completely diminishes everything that they had, the connection that they'd made the night before, because he's now paying him bribery money or something. So Declan goes into the kitchen to find his mum and his dad there, and he says, what the heck do you think you're doing? Give me $300. I don't want your money. And and Alan says, no, you've got it all wrong. You told me that it would cost $300 if I took it to a mechanic to fix it, and I only saved all the money that I saved because of your knowledge and know-how. That because you fixed my car, I want to pay you as though I'd taken it to a mechanic and you're the mechanic. It's a really beautiful moment. And then he says, and I'm not the only one. There is someone else who's calling who wants you to... There's a moment in the story where Declan is with his boss has called him and said that a friend of the boss is having trouble with a car that he's rebuilding, re-putting together, and Declan comes over and gives some advice on that. This guy, who doesn't seem to want to take the advice that Declan is giving him at the time, turns out now actually wants Declan to, help fix his car and become his mechanic. And in a world where Declan feels like he is a failure and he's not going to go anywhere, by the time we get to the end of the book, it seems like things are going somewhere for him and things are going really, really well for him. I do want to quickly make mention there is a moment that we have with Declan and his English teacher, which is also incredibly beautiful. They're reading poems in class, and the poem is really affecting Declan because his mother used to read to him. I think it was his mum. Someone used to read it to him, and it was really affecting him considering everything that had gone down since that time, with everything that's gone down. And so finally his English teacher ends up talking to him, and he admits that to her, and she says, okay, look, why don't you read this another completely different poem by a completely different author altogether? Why don't you read this one instead? And, And so he does, and he really loves this poem, and he does an assignment on that and does really well in the assignment, and the teacher calls him in early and says, I'd actually like to place you into the AP class. For those of you like me who are in Australia, AP stands for Advanced Placement, so it's like a higher up level than your standard level of English. And Declan can't believe, again, considering he himself feels that he's a failure, he can't believe someone's putting him into an AP class. He's never been in an AP class before. And the English teacher says, look, you can handle it. Judging by this, you can. You may be a month behind, but you can handle this. You can catch up. So he ends up doing that. And it's just such a beautiful ending. Eventually, I think right at the end of the last chapter, Declan and Juliet end up, meeting in person, knowing that they're the two that were communicating, and they, fall in love and they kiss, and that's basically the end of the book. And that's why I'm not calling it a romance, because it never came across as a romance. They didn't even kiss till right at the end. So to me, it was never a romance at all. It was always a contemporary dealing with death and loss, and it was just so amazing and so very powerful that, as I said, it was such an emotional read for me, especially from the second half onwards. But it's not to say the first half was a waste of time. Not at all. It was building us up with the situation, what was going on. I don't know if it's appropriate to say world building because it's not a fantasy, but if you can say world building when it comes to a contemporary, they are Bridget Kemmerer is building us up with world building, contemporary world building, for the first half of the chapter, and having us understand the characters more, and the situation, what's going on, and having us get used to Juliet and Declan writing to each other, and basically spilling their guts on what's been going on with them in their lives. But the second half of the book was just so emotional and so well done that I explicitly trust Bridget Kemmerer after reading this book, and I will definitely be reading the second book in the series, and I also want to read more from Bridget Kemmerer because of just how well done this book was. I end up giving this book 5 stars. I highly, highly recommend this book to anyone who doesn't feel that they will be triggered by two characters that are discussing death and loss. Anyone who doesn't feel they'll be triggered by that, please pick up this book because it is so underrated. You will not regret it. The first half you might find to be a little simplistic, but the second half, oh my god, so worth it. So there it is for you. So please take a screenshot and make sure you pick up this book. I don't have any affiliate links or anything like that at all. I am literally reviewing and advertising this book because I want to, not because anyone's told me to. But there are many bookstores that do stock this book. It's just underrated. So I do highly recommend you either purchase this book or that you get it from your library or put it on hold at your local library, because you will not regret reading it. And that is where I'm going to leave it. This book is a YA contemporary, Letters to the Lost by Bridget Kemmerer, that I've given 5 stars to, letting you guys go peace, blessings, and so much love. Mwah. I post videos every Thursday and Sunday with reviews and other videos in between, and I'll see you again soon. Bye guys, happy reading, bye!